Our final presenter this afternoon in the first session is Orlindo Montilla Burton. She's the director and curator of the Museo de Oro at Xavier University at Cagayan de Oro on the island of Mindanao in the Philippines. Dr. Burton has her BA in psychology and social work and her MA in anthropology from Brigham Young University, and her PhD in medical anthropology from the University of Pittsburgh. So Dr. Burton, please join us, and then we will do our dialogue.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're already awake after all the break. Let me say greetings to you in Filipino. Magandang hapon po sa inyong lahat, which means good afternoon to all. I'm sure you won't be able to repeat that. I am really, truly very grateful for the conference sponsors for giving me the chance to share with you my story about the indigenous people in southern Philippines. The title of my paper is Revival of the Indigenous Knowledge of Indigenous Peoples of Southern Philippines. As we know, indigenous knowledge has been neglected for quite a while because it has been believed by some scientists to be not scientific, and so they've ignored it quite a while. And in the Philippines, they are now recognizing the importance and significance of indigenous knowledge. So that they have been encouraging, even the Department of Science and Technology is being encouraged by the government to go into research about indigenous knowledge of the different groups in the Philippines. So let me start with my introduction. Land and environment, together with the people's social, political, and religious system, are interwoven into an integrated cultural system. This is the basis for indigenous knowledge system. The indigenous communities in the Philippines are still the repository of traditional knowledge, which is also rapidly vanishing due to many factors. This paper is about two indigenous communities in the island of Mindanao in southern Philippines, where indigenous knowledge systems are in the state of being lost or forgotten because they cease to practice them. However, some of the traditional knowledge were rediscovered and revived through the use of participatory research approaches, which we used, our research institute used. And these are what we call adaptive collaborative management, or ACM, and the Cultural Inventory Survey, or CIS. ACM was able to harness traditional knowledge of medicinal plants in the Talaandig tribe, while the CIS rediscovered the knowledge of cotton weaving in the Matigsalug Manubu community, as I will show later. So this paper aims to share the experiences of the two communities in the rediscovery of their IKS, which they mobilized for their own development. Just to give you a little profile of the two communities. First, let me say a little bit about Mindanao. As I will show the map where it is in the Philippines. The island of Mindanao is the second largest island in the country. It is situated in the southern region, and it is the home of more than 30 ethno-linguistic groups, who most of them still inhabit the uplands in the different parts of the island. Just to tell you a little bit about the indigenous people before I go on to the profile very briefly. The island of Mindanao is composed of three groups of people. First would be the indigenous people who have lived there from time immemorial. And the other group is known as the Moros, or the Muslim Filipinos, who are situated in the southwestern part of the island. And the majority of the population there are mostly migrant settlers who came from different parts of the country. So they are called the tribe people because of this three composition of different ethnic groups. And so I will be presenting the profile of the two communities. This is the map of Mindanao. Oops, sorry. Uh-oh, yeah. That was... This is the map of Mindanao, and this part here is where the Muslim Filipinos live in this area. And the indigenous people are scattered in different parts of the island, and there are about more than 30 indigenous, ethno-linguistic groups of indigenous people, and they're found here, and from the north down to the south. And then through most of the islands, this is populated by what we call the migrant settlers coming from different islands of the country. First, let me tell you a little bit about the first community that we have conducted work with. This is the province of Bukidnon, and this is where we call the home of this Lantapan, and in the village of Basak, this is where the Talaandig people live. And in this area, there is also a big mountain range, the second tallest mountain in the Philippines, where it is been declared as the national park. This is a national protected park because it is heavily forested. So, sorry, I'm not very good in in computer. That's wrong. Oh, okay. We have the Talaandig community that inhabit the foothills of Mount Kitangla. This is the one I was citing a while ago. And they live within the community-based forestry management program, which is we call CBFM. And they practiced soybean cultivation in the past. Some of them are still doing it, but now being stopped by the government. And now being replaced, the subsistence pattern is now being replaced by plow agriculture. They used to do soybean cultivation. The Talaandig have their own conservation and management program of their forest, and it was regulated by their customary laws. And the breach of which would invoke violation of the spiritual domain, and those who violated this are meted with cultural penalty, such as fine or even death. They had a vast core of indigenous knowledge about their environment and the use of its resources and their forest ecology. And today is still being kept balanced by their ideological system linked with their belief in nature spirits. Next is the community of the Matigsalog. They're found in this other map. They're found in this area. This is where we are currently working. We have a project here. Our outreach team is working in this area. The Matigsalog are found inhabiting along the Salog River and other mountain ecozone. As you can see here, there's a very small village. Oops, sorry. Oh boy. I was just here a few days before I left for the US. And this is the river that is always overflowing when there's a heavy rain because the watershed, the headwaters, are now devastated. And this area now is denuded because the migrant settlers have come to farm this area. And I was there was the flood, this place here was overflooded. You can hear the roaring of the river. So we were staying in this house. This is what we call Tulugan. Tulugan is the visitor center. So the Matigsalog are still practicing the slash and burn farming, and they supplemented by hunting and foraging. And they are really much closer to the forest where they obtain the resources and are believed to be endowed to them by the spirits, or they call them Diwata. The Matigsalog described in this paper dwell in the small river valley, as I've already shown a while ago, and quite distant from other settlements. They still practice much of their traditional ways and indigenous knowledge, except that some are in the verge of vanishing. Some of them are still using their indigenous clothing, and this was taken about a month ago, and we were having a meeting. And so these two communities have been kept separated from the rest of the other communities, from the lowland settlers, and that's why they were able to keep some of their indigenous knowledge. But then the advent of change altered some of their ways, especially the lowland areas. When, as you know, the Philippines was under Spain for over 300 years, and after which the Americans came over in 1900, when Spain sold the Philippines to the United States for the worth of $20 million. Very, very small, I mean, considering today. So we were under the Americans for 50 years. And of course, the Spanish imprint in the Filipino culture has not changed a lot, and we still have a lot of the Spanish elements, except for the language. But then the Americans has a bigger impact on the culture of the Filipinos. So these photos here actually show when the Americans came. These people that are in front are natives, and they were native warriors. What the Americans did, used them to fight against the Muslim Filipinos, and they allowed them to use their own indigenous implements in fighting. And the Americans are here in the background watching. So that was a very, very good old photo of the time when the Americans came there. So Mindanao was considered a last frontier and was opened for resettlement of poor landless families from different regions of the country. The island is very rich with natural resources, timber, minerals, fertile lands, and so on, which enticed foreign and local investors to explore and exploit these resources for their own gains. Consequently, they destroyed the forest lands through surreptitious logging and mining, and led to the denudation of the mountains. The indigenous populations were displaced from their ancestral domains and lost the right to access to their resources. Like the other indigenous communities in the other parts of the world, they became strangers in their own land. So, In the study of indigenous knowledge, what we did was to use participatory approaches. So these are the two approaches that I mentioned a while ago, the adaptive collaborative management, or ACM, and the other one is cultural inventory survey. A little bit on the ACM. This approach was a concept that is rooted in collaborative management techniques. This was modified and initially used by the Center for International Forestry Research, CIFOR, which is based in Bogor, Indonesia, by integrating elements of collaborative management and adaptive management. ACM is defined as a long-term management structure that permits stakeholders to share management responsibility within a specific system of natural resources and learn from their actions. The process of ACM is characterized as a conscious communication, collaboration, and seeking out to learn as a group called social learning. It is learning action and knowledge sharing among group members. Along with the ACM process, we used participatory action research, which I think many of you are very aware of. And this method allows local people to participate and empower them in addressing their own problems. How did we know about ACM and participatory research? In 2002, CIFOR, in partnership with the Research Institute for Mindanao Culture, at that time, this is based at Xavier University, and at the time I was the director of the institute, and they asked us if we could work with us to introduce ACM. And we were able to choose a community, which is now the Talaanding community, to enhance social development and the people's capabilities in protecting and managing forest resources. So the ACM, it's really very interesting, along with the participatory research, has this notion. Participatory research, as we know, has three main elements. You have the reflection, the planning, and the action. And so when there is a problem, the people go, or the group, the community go into reflection. And they would reflect on the problem, and after which they would do planning. And after planning, they would put this into action. And after the action, if they see any problem again, they would reflect on it, and then plan again, and then whatever they have planned, they would put into action. And this is iterative until they are able to come up and solve the problem. This is a very interesting methodology which we found very, very effective, especially among the communities that we're working. So through the use of PAR, we were able to during the time of assessment of problems in the community, using PAR, we were able to, the people were able to focus on a very important issue, which is the health issue. And this was given priority because of the high prevalence of illness and disease in the community. And it was also a pressing problem because of the unavailability of medicine, which are both, like for example, there's a lack of traditional, and even the modern medicine or synthetic medicine was not present in that community. And so after the meetings and discussion, a health group was organized. And they discussed and reflect on the problems. And the decision was to harness their indigenous knowledge in curing through the use of medicinal plants that are found in the community that are endemic and both endemic and indigenous, which still abound in their environment since they have been part of their community history and culture. And so this shows, this shows the reflection part, the women, which is composed of mostly, the organization was composed mostly of women, are now discussing what to do next. They're now doing a reflection, and then they went into planning, which is participated by the man who was pointing is actually the president of the People's Organization, and he was responsible for guiding the group for planning, and this is what they planned. This is the result of their planning session. And then action was to put up a medicinal herbs were propagated through collective action. So everything that they do is collective. And so this is the garden that they prepared, participated by both men and women. And then finally, they found out that with all these medicinal herbs, what are we going to do with this? We don't know how to prepare. They have very little knowledge. The knowledge that they used to have is now gone, because the older women, who used to know how to prepare the concoction are now dead. So they linked with an NGO devoted to traditional medicine to conduct training in herbal medicine preparation. And then those who were trained were also trained mothers about practical diagnostic and herbal processing procedures. So this is this is how they do it. They have all the herbs, leaves, and roots of plants. And they were taught how to process. So the efforts of the health group had impact on the community. More women wanted to plant herbs and be trained in the process of preparation. This is the result of their training, and they were able to come up with syrup for a cough and other liniments, for example, for massaging, and other types of medicine where they were able to get out, extracted from the different plants. For sustainability of the project, a nursery was established where interested individuals could obtain plants for their own herbal gardens. Training and preparation was also available for those who would want it. So that was, and until now, we were able to get some fund to be able to expand their area, and more of these plants are being propagated and participated. Even the local government is interested now in having their own local people in the primary health station to learn about herbal preparation. The second community wherein we did participatory cultural inventory, this term was coined by UNESCO, which is the participatory collection of ethnographic data through the use of survey by some members of the community. So everything here is participatory. People are the ones making decisions. They're the ones that are doing the work. What we just facilitate some of the, if there are any problems at all. We have an outreach team of RIMCO, and the RIMCO, as I've said, is a research institute, but we also have our own outreach team wherein we work with Dimatig Salog Manobo on their development program, wherein we conducted research on the indigenous knowledge system of the varied plants utilized for food, medicine, handicrafts, and so on. And so this is the decision wherein it would show the one facilitating, we were the ones facilitating, and the man here is the son of the chieftain, and this is the chieftain here listening. Oops. And he was trying to explain the importance of going back to the indigenous knowledge, because now they've lost many of indigenous lore about their environment. So in one of the questions we asked, cotton plants emerged to have been used for weaving, but was discontinued due to the government's policy through the government's policy to bring the cultural communities to mainstream society. So instead of really encouraging to preserve the indigenous knowledge, the government said, no, we would want you to be just like the others, be more modern, and so on. And the plant that we found out, the cotton plant, is a variety called Eusephium barbadense. So we asked the people, where is this cotton plant? And they showed us. And so we made more research on this plant. And we found out that this variety is known as Eusephium barbadense, which grow in 3 settlements. This is not indigenous to the area, nor was weaving, but they were introduced from the southeastern coastal region of the island, believed to be from India, brought by the Arabs or the Hindu traders about 300 years ago. It's quite a long time. And so, they were able to preserve this knowledge which they have adapted and became a part of their indigenous knowledge. In weaving, they use the backstrap type of loom and the spindle whorl to spin the cotton thread. And they use red colors, which is a sap of the vine, and this is used for dyeing the thread. And so this woman here, living in a very small hut, is doing the weaving. Very, very crude. The prototype of the loom is still very crude, and yet she was able to, do her own work. And this is the process, so she does it first and goes into next steps. And then she was able to make a thread, and put it in the spindle whorl. And this is how now she goes into weaving. The rediscovery of the cotton weaving also encouraged the remaining old traditional weavers in the village to revive their almost forgotten IKS on cotton weaving. And as you see here, the older women, this one is the oldest, and still remembers it very well. And now she's teaching the younger women how to do it and how to select the cotton balls from the plant. So, for sustainability of this, a nursery was started to propagate cotton plants, and a tract of land was set aside for plantation, and more loom prototypes are being made. When I left, there were already 2 loom prototypes that they were working on. The revival of cotton weaving through the transfer of traditional knowledge of the old weavers to the younger women is very significant for the Matigsalog because this would preserve the cultural pattern for posterity. It would likewise enhance the Matigsalog textile tradition and further encourage research specifically on symbolic significance of textile in relation to their belief system. It would likewise enhance I wouldn't mention that. And for conclusion, the advent of modern trends to the indigenous communities in Mindanao, many of the indigenous knowledge had ceased to be practiced because they had either been replaced by new practices or merely lost to oblivion. The rediscovery and revival of the indigenous knowledge of the 2 communities in Mindanao have instigated the people's appreciation of their cultural tradition and strengthened the resolve to hold on to them as part of their self-determination. Thank you very much. Madugin u salamat in matugsalog, madakul ha salamat in talaandig. Thank you.
I'll take that. And I'll shake your hand.
Okay.
Let me introduce Tammy Wabb and Askham. Tammy's sitting over in the corner here, and she's going to help facilitate our dialogue. We have a microphone for our panelists, and we're going to use this one. And so you may address your questions to an individual panelist, or you can address a question to the panel at large for them to respond to. And if you'll just raise your hands, Tammy will get the microphone to you, and I'll try and give hand signals about when you're up. And we'll need to move quickly through our dialogue so that we can have a little break before our next session. So, questions for our panel? Joel.
Thank you. Dr. Burton, there was a term that you used earlier in your presentation that I didn't understand. It was, I believe it was Swidden farming. Could you explain that, please?
Okay. Yes, that is slash and burn farming, and wherein you cut down the trees and then burn, the parts that were cut down. And in Philippines, we call it kaingin, and I think in Mexico, they call it milpa. And Sweden is a Swedish term, I think. It's a European term used, and anthropologists have been using this.
Other questions for our panel?
Again, Dr. Montiel Burton.
Yeah.
Who initiated the projects that you've just described to us, and were they, and who made the decisions on how to do them and how to implement them? I'm just curious.
Okay. The ACM, the first one that I mentioned, was actually, many of us were trained in it. The C4 people came to Xavier University, and when they introduced to us about this, we were very excited to learn this new method. And so they were with us for about 3 months, and so we will learn, and then we go to the community and sort of, practice, we call it, and finally got the hold of the whole concept and also the process of the methodology. And then we went into the community because we selected that. So beside the one in Mindanao, there was another site which was selected by C4. This is in the island of Palawan. So there are actually 2 communities here for which ACM was introduced. But I'm very familiar with the one in Mindanao because I was involved in the collection of the data.
I don't know if it's a question. I have some comments. I want to thank you, brother from Belize, because you mentioned decolonization, and that's really crucial and it's really important, because we need to decolonize on all fronts before we do anything that we've talked about here today. When we talk about research, we need to be decolonized before we do research. We must use our own indigenous paradigms. And our brother from British Columbia touched on that as well, and I want to say thank you. How do we decolonize ourselves? How do we get into that process? Because no matter who we are and no matter how much of an identity we have of ourselves, we're all colonized in some form. And how do we really dive into that? Even when we're looking at sustainable development, how do we decolonize ourselves enough to have a decolonized sustainable development? We must develop our own ethics, our own indigenous paradigms on research. And when we talk about losses of who we are and our identities, I think we need to be very clear that we have to define ourselves through our ancestors and our elders that are left. Because as our brother said, and as he quoted Linda Smith, that when we use other texts, we're making viable their definitions of ourselves. And it's really good that you have an Algonquin and all the publishers there, and that we're beginning to define ourselves through our own eyes. So if there's any comments from the panel on this, I'd like to hear it as well. But I'm really glad it was brought up because it's crucial to our sustainability and to our identities as Indigenous peoples everywhere. Thank you.
Well, I just in response to your comment, I think a lot of times when we talk about the decolonization, obviously there are already elements of the colonizers' framework in our own. I don't think that the question of decolonization is necessarily going back, right, or becoming pure, right, kind of this essential notion of who it is that we are. I like to talk about that indigenous people are not so much about the preservation of culture, okay, but rather the creation of, creating a space for the production of culture. Because I think if we think about preservation of culture, putting it in some kind of bottle and storing it there, we would be giving up our role as social actors. In other words, it's not so much about repeating traditions over and over and over and over, because we would then, as I said, give up our role as social actors, but rather taking that cultural baggage that we bring and working with that in response to a lived reality. So I don't think that there should be this notion of kind of like pureness or essentialism in when we think about who it is that we are and about our culture.
Yeah, that's a pretty tough question, where to start our decolonization process. I talk about that in another paper and outline the first 4 steps. That's available online for $49.95. No, I'm just kidding. It's really a matter of seeing where our communities are at, because there's so many stages within decolonization, just from our families, let alone our community, then our nation. And it's hard because a lot of our youth are the ones that get hit the hardest. So as far as decolonizing, that's where we have to start, because they go through our educational systems that view us in the way they do. They see TV that view us in the way they do, and there's all those other areas, and it's just a collective understanding of who we are, which is a good start too, because a lot of our teachings there's different interpretations between how to do things. So we have to come to an understanding of, well, this is the way we have to move forward and indigenize all these outside cultural activities that we've engaged in, such as economics. What is indigenous economics? So I guess that's all I wanted to say in your comments, and thank you for your comments. Yeah.
That dialogue of decolonization will last for generations, by the way. Over here?
No, Diógenes.
Ya, que me disculpen que no hablo inglés.
Excuse me because I don't speak English.
Solamente 2 cuestiones. A los organizadores, creo que en la mañana también hubo temas muy interesantes que debió explorar, preguntar. Me quedé con ganas. Una recomendación, creo que a partir de mañana se puede hacer espacio para preguntarlos.
I would like to make some recommendations. This morning we had some really interesting speakers and we had some really interesting dialogue, but it kind of ended there. So I'm hoping that there's some space tomorrow morning and there's some space after people speak where we can have some dialogue as well.
Digo esto porque me quedé con las ganas de preguntar a la presidenta organizadora que en la mañana expusieron.
I'm mentioning this because there's some questions that I'd like to talk to the organizer and the president about.
Dicho esto, quiero preguntar al hermano de Belice, que más o menos le he entendido.
I also would like to have some questions for my brother from Belize, and he'll understand me, but I'm translating for everybody else.
En caso de Perú, el Estado elabora la ley e impone como oficialmente no distingue que son los pueblos costeños, andinos y amazónicos. Ustedes son peruanos y tienen que entrar en una sola bolsa. Entonces, ese es el problema.
In Peru, we have a problem that our government just says that we're all Peruvians. We might be from the coast, we might be from the Andes, we might be from the Amazons, but they put us all in the same kind of purse and say, that's it, that's all.
¿Ustedes cómo están haciendo? Porque el Congreso de la República que aprueba la ley se aplica, pero no sé si es iniciativa de los pueblos indígenas, cómo han incidido, están tratando oficialmente, el Estado está respetando eso de educación intercultural, eso me gustaría intercambiar.
What I'd like to know is how you're going about doing what you're doing with education. Is this respected by the government? Are there laws that follow it? Are you doing it on your own as indigenous people? I really want to know how you're doing it and what you're doing.
Gracias, Sequachet.
I'm not sure whether to respond in Spanish or English. Or maybe I shouldn't respond in both of them. I'll respond in English first and then I'll translate. Well, I think that this idea that we all are Peruvians or we are all Americans or we are all Belizeans is usually used to kind of avoid talking about the importance of cultural diversity, used to erase difference. In fact, a lot of times the idea that the country is going to break apart if we recognize those differences is always brought up. Okay, I was listening to the presidential debate here in the United States just 2 nights ago, and the issue, for example, of migrants to the United States, and saying, well, we have so many millions of people who are here already. When are we going to have the chance to assimilate them? Right? We don't want to recognize the different languages, etc. The case of Belize is similar. The issue that we are all Belizeans is always brought up, okay, to reject the idea of a plural society. And it's a struggle that we constantly have to give. We have to constantly struggle to change that. The way that we have seen it is that, one, we can try to change policy, okay, which is always a difficult thing. And in any case, a lot of times you have beautiful policy that is developed but really translates into very little. The other way that we see we can bring about change is to simply change. In other words, the initiative that we started in Belize, for example, is something that started outside of the legal framework. And then inviting the Ministry of Education, inviting policymakers to see the validity of this, and I think that is beginning to convince them. And of course, forming alliances with agencies such as the United Nations and so on. So I think that the struggle that you have in Peru is pretty similar to the one in Belize. Nonetheless, I think that it's something that needs to be done. And many times, I think I would say, we have to operate outside of the law, and that's perhaps part of the process of decolonization. If you have to ask permission for doing something, probably it's never gonna happen.
Dile en español ahora, por favor.
Bueno. Bueno, creo que el tema de que todos somos peruanos o todos somos beliceños, todos somos americanos, siempre se utiliza como argumento en contra del respeto a la diversidad, de la importancia de la pluralidad. Mencionaba yo que hace un par de días escuchaba yo los debates presidenciales en Estados Unidos y se hablaba, por ejemplo, sobre, bueno, resalta ahí el temor que hace la diferencia, no querer reconocer, digamos, los lenguajes de los diferentes pueblos, porque eso va a dividir. Inglés es el idioma oficial y no se puede cambiar. O sea, nos rehúsa reconocer la diversidad que existe. Es la misma situación en Belice, ¿no? Donde se utiliza, todos somos beliceños para decir, no hay que reconocer eso. De hecho, se habla de que si empezamos a reconocer esas diferencias, lo que vamos a hacer es fragmentar el Estado beliceño, ¿no? En el caso nuestro de esta iniciativa, pues bueno, consideramos de que hay dos formas de generar el cambio. Uno es a través de promover el cambio de una política pública, lo cual muchas veces es muy difícil. O la otra es simple iniciar algo, aunque fuera del marco legal, e invitar entonces a los oficiales a reconocer eso, y es lo que está sucediendo. Y también la formación de alianzas con organizaciones como de las Naciones Unidas, etc.
Thank you. I want to thank our panelists. I want to suggest that this dialogue is just beginning, and we'll have many more opportunities to visit and share. I was struck by the fact that this panel brought to us the challenge of reclaiming our intellectual sovereignty in our institutions, in education, in how we take care of ourselves, in our material culture, and in our forms of leadership and governance. Before we take a break, I have two quick announcements. One is in your packet, there is an evaluation form for today's events. Would you do us the favor, please, of completing the evaluation for Monday? You can either leave it right on the table and staff will pick it up, or you can drop it at the registration desk. Or you can just hold it in the air and somebody will come pick it up. The second thing I want to do before we take a quick break before our final afternoon session is to personally thank you. It's been my privilege to serve as the moderator for this session, and I want to introduce my colleague, Dr. Diana Morris, who will be the facilitator for the final session this afternoon. Dr. Morris. All right, let's take a quick 15-minute break and return here for our next panel. Again, thank you.